Good afternoon, everyone, to all of you attending this session in person at the University of Lisbon, as well as to all of the online attendees through this ongoing cooperation between the UNESCO Chair on the Futures of Education and the UNESCO Brazil co-workers. As you know, we had originally scheduled UNESCO Director or Under Director General, Sub-Director General Stefania Giannini. She nevertheless was unable to join us today because she had to travel to China. So we have rescheduled Stefania Giannini's participation for the 15th of December, and the cycle of conferences will be therefore established according to the schedule on the screen. We will be having Professor António Damião, Professor Danieri, or Professor Jorge Ramos, all on the 27th of October, and Professor Nina Ranieri from the University of São Paulo. And then we will have the most important figures from the United Nations in education, Mr. Leonardo Garnier, who is in charge of the United Nations Education Summit. And then on the 15th of December, Stefania Giannini, who is the Under Director General for Education at UNESCO. And on the 23rd of February, Antonio Damasio, and on the 22nd of March, Farid Shahid. And it is always going to be a difficult choice for us, but we believe we will have with us the three most important intellectuals on education today. Representing neurosciences, we will have Professor Antonio Damasio, and representing education philosophy and related issues, Mr. Gert Biesta, and representing social sciences and anthropology, Arjun Appadurai, who will close this cycle of conferences. These conferences are aimed at helping us think about the future in the overall framework of the UNESCO initiatives on the futures of education. And the background to all of these conferences is the purpose of preventing us from falling into the delusions or illusions of the futurists and the school of thought that seems to preach that we have now witnessed the end of schools, that schools are all online today. So this is the primary approach governing this cycle of conferences. And today we will have the first panel session of these conferences. My very brief presentation today will be working from this premise. In other words, the premise of preventing us from falling into the illusions of the futurists. There are three main illusions that are very much prevalent in today's world, in social media, etc. The first such illusion is the idea that education is ubiquitous, the ubiquity education. Education can happen anywhere and at all times and in all places. The pandemic pretty much disseminated the idea that education could take place pretty much anywhere and any time, which is partly true, yes, but let us bear in mind that it does not take place naturally. Neither does it happen or take place without the actual intervention of specialized practitioners or professionals. So this first illusion, which seems to circulate in so many settings, it requires a lot of caution. The second, say, illusion about education that seems to circulate out there is precisely the illusion that everything can be translated into measurable learning or types of learning that can ultimately be measured. And may I call the attention of those who are doctoral students in education attending this seminar. On the one hand, there's the criticism voiced by Gert Biesta for quite a few years now, a criticism against what he describes as being the largification, in other words, an extrapolation of the discourse on learning as if all forms of education could possibly be described from the learning side only. In our Education Institute, we have extensively researched measurable education or measurable learning, including a critique to the PISA and some of the OECD rationales to measure education. So in today's world, it is important to say that yes, learning is important, yes, but not everything about education can be measured from a learning perspective. And stating that is tantamount to stating that there are many forms of learning that take place by oneself without anyone else's involvement. But education is by definition a collective act. No one can educate oneself by oneself in one's own. We can learn things by ourselves, but we cannot educate ourselves on our own. So that is an important distinction to help us not fall in the illusion of largification, if you will, to use a concept voiced by Gert Biesta. And obviously enough, the third illusion involving technologies, the illusion that some of us have described as being the technological solutionism, as if the solution to all education-related problems should ultimately stem from technologies. That is perhaps the largest illusion that has been disseminated during the pandemic. It added a further dimension to this illusion. So we must be very cautious about these three different illusions, that of ubiquity, that of the measurable learning, and also the technologies, if we are serious about thinking of education in a useful, instrumental fashion as we look towards the future, without, of course, denying or without destroying everything that the schools and that the education system have achieved in the past century. Our French colleague, François Dubé, has a sentence, and I think it very much casts light to what I have just described. The school in the school setting is better than homeschooling or better than a digital schooling. And he has an entire text, an article on this important dimension of the school in the school setting. The article helps us understand and explain the importance of education within the educational setting, and as well as the importance of the school as a key and essential institution for the future. Recently, UNESCO published a series of articles on technologies, which I believe should be examined and read, especially the GEM publications dated 2023. And more particularly, the most recent report published about 2 or 3 weeks ago, and its title is very telling. It is a long, lengthy report, more than 600 pages, and the main author is Mark West, and the title of the report is a question mark, an ed-tech tragedy, the tragedy resulting from educational technology, where he explains and provides a comprehensive review of what has happened with the use of technologies in education, especially during the pandemic. And he comes to the conclusion that technologies have indeed helped us solve some problems, true, but technologies have actually created more problems than solutions. He also found that technologies have managed to solve or help overcome some emergency situations, true, but technologies have ultimately led to more inequality, more exclusion, and more problems than solutions. It is as such a critical text on the use of technologies in education, but one which obviously enough does not call into question the importance of technologies. Rather, it does call into question the way technologies are used in education and the way technologies are appropriated for by the schools and by the educational discussions and in pedagogical agendas. In those three areas I referred to, ubiquity, learning, and technologies, of course, there is no, say, naivete from a political perspective, because when it comes to the ubiquities, the technologies, and the learning side of education, these are all components of a global expansion of the education industry worldwide, which has pretty much taken over our education systems. It has pretty much taken over education all over the world, and I mean literally all over the world, from Brazil to China, from Northern Europe all the way down to Africa. And has had a substantial impact on the way education has been produced or developed. It is impossible for us to think about those three illusions: the illusion of ubiquity, the illusion of measurable learning, and the illusion of technologies, without framing them in a critical reflection on the growth, the expansion, and the way how this global education industry has developed in the recent past. Having said that, as part of my second topic in this presentation, the proposal currently on the table is about fostering or developing a new social contract for education to tackle these illusions while facing up to the future of education, and do so by attempting to build a new social contract for education. This or that is the proposal contained in the UNESCO 2021 report, and that is the proposal that we will be promoting in the course of this cycle of conferences, and with the contribution of so many towering figures and guest speakers who will take part in the cycle of conferences. And in the current education debate, there are two key words or central concepts. Number one, reinforcing education as a public good, as a shared public good, as opposed to a privately oriented advocacy of education, and advocating education as a public and shared good. When I say public, I don't mean state-owned, I mean collective, public for society. And also advocating education as a public and shared or common good that is inseparably associated with human rights as enshrined in the 1948 Declaration, as well as associated with the new human rights, the Earth-related human rights, and the human rights involving digital access, migrations, diversity, and the new or emerging human rights involving the new labor relations, and the emerging human rights as a result of societies where several generations will live and will work together in one and the same space as a result of longer life expectations or life expectancies. Thinking of education as a public and common good to provide content and shape to this new social contract for education. What I'm trying to say is that we must protect the school. We must be very cautious about those who preach that we have witnessed the end of the school system and that the school system has become obsolete. The 21st century or the 20th century schools are not able to solve the 21st century issues. We have to be very cautious about this kind of discourse, which in one way or another end up eroding an institution that is an absolutely remarkable and outstanding institution, which must be protected, but which also has to be transformed from now onwards. In other words, it is not enough to just talk about protecting the school. It is more importantly necessary to talk about how to transform schools. And let me propose the concept of metamorphosis from Mr. Edgar Morin. It's about changing the way schools work, and the concept helps us think about schools in a different light, in a different approach, and from a different organizational perspective. Those who are familiar with the history of education know all too well that historians have developed several concepts to this effect. I have often used the concept of school models, but several schools have used the concept of school form or format, and some American historians have used the concept of school grammar, and the French have espoused different concepts, and there are several different concepts that have been used to translate the idea of the school model that has found its way to our modern times of today. I will not go into the details of these several different concepts about the school model or format, but all I'm going to say is that schools must change the way they work. And let me use a metaphor here, and please pay attention to what I'm going to say and take it as a metaphor. The metaphor I'm going to use is the metaphor of novel educational environments. In other words, the schools must rethink themselves. They must recreate themselves and do so on the basis of new environmental education or new educational settings or environments. The educational environment that has lasted up until now has proved to be outstanding in many areas, really outstanding in terms of the way we conceived of and designed the school classroom and the school furniture, and the way we organized the use of space and the use of blackboards or chalkboards, and also the way we conceived the pedagogical agenda and teachers' work. All of that really has proved an outstanding invention. True. However, that educational environment or setting of that school is no longer capable of living up to the challenges of the future. We must create or forge a new educational environment. And for those of you who are familiar with the history of philosophy, you may be asking yourselves, why is it that for at least 100 years, pedagogy has been talking about student creativity. Pedagogy has been talking about school autonomy and about active schools and cooperation and pedagogical differentiation. Why is it that all of these proposals have not truly materialized so far? Well, the answer is because we have tried to materialize this pedagogical agenda, to use Dewey's concept. We have tried to materialize this pedagogical agenda in educational environments or settings that were not properly prepared and as such are not suitable to accommodate this pedagogical agenda. We are trying to do things through our activism and through our efforts and mobilization with our energy, things that are nevertheless not suitable or in line with the existing educational environments. They're absolutely not conducive to help us overcome the challenges we propose to overcome. The educational environment or setting in an ordinary school has proved outstanding so far, but as you can yourselves, as I'm sure you know yourselves, there's a great deal of things that we can do in this kind of environment, but again, there are many things that cannot possibly be done in this kind of environment. For example, it is very difficult to work in groups. It is very difficult to buy something. It is very difficult to collaborate in this kind of environment. So the environment, I'm using the term environment here as a metaphor, in that I'm not referring only to the physical space, but to more than that. It's the atmosphere, the setting. Philippe Bourdieu said that in a school, stones, rocks think, the walls think. The architecture is also designed to think, true. But it's not only about an architectural issue or problem. It's more than that. It's all about what this environment helps do or fosters or proves conducive to in terms of the pedagogical agenda or student work or teachers' work as part of the everyday agenda and work in the school setting. For that reason, environments will evolve towards more diverse settings and environments where a different kind of reality can materialize in such a way as to ensure that these new environments prove conducive to accommodating the new ideas and concepts about the future of education. And let me refer to a second metaphor to describe the future of education. And the question here is, what is the key difference between what we used to do before and what we are called upon to do from now onwards? The key difference lies in one word: work.
Work that was said and repeated by people in education, new schools, the pioneers of the new schools in the case of Brazil, the generation of new schools in Portugal, Switzerland, France, and so forth. The new school is called a new school. Before it was called a work school, working school, and they've lost the concept of work to adopt the concept of new school and the idea of work, not in the sense of manual labor. I'm talking about in the sense of work. The schools as that place where the children read, where the children write, where the children study alone, where the children study with others in groups, where they do research, where they conduct projects, where they solve problems, where they develop themes, where they make creations. This place where the children work. I mean, what a philosopher said 100 years ago, precisely 1923, he said that I dream of a school where people who work are the students and not the teachers. I dream of a school where those who work are the students and not the teachers. Of course, for there to be work by the students, it's necessary for there to be much work by the teachers. But this metaphor of work, the one which allows one very simply to better explain what is the reality of this new educational environment. The reality of the new educational environment is the reality of the metaphor of work. Likewise, from the previous environmental education, the central metaphor was that of classes or the blackboard. And now the metaphor for the new school is that of work, in a sense also of schools who serve greater diversity and greater inclusion. Allow me, therefore, in the third section, to tell you I'm going to be very brief and I'm going to be very almost give the broad strokes and not precisely can do a detailed argumentation. The third section, I'm therefore going to attempt to say 5 words. I want to answer the question, metamorphosis, how? How can we achieve a metamorphosis in education? These are my 5 words. They're my 5 words that I have chosen, but in a sense they are present in the central portion of the UNESCO report and reimagining the futures for the new social contract for education. In this, it's behind this initiative in the report, and it's behind the UNESCO Chair on Futures for Education. The central part of the report consists of 5 chapters. In these 5 chapters in the UNESCO report, it's my interpretation, my reading. They're not written explicitly. What I'm saying here, it's not written there explicitly in all the chapters, but my interpretation, my reading of them includes 5 words. One of them in each chapter, 5 words. There are 5 concepts, 5 words, which are 5 concepts, and which are 5 important changes in our thinking. The word cooperation, the word convergence, the word collaboration, the word conviviality, and the word citizenship. I should say that I don't hesitate between the word capillarity or citizenship. I hesitate between the word, but capillarity, that word appears to be a word which is somewhat, it's like a metaphor. It's too physical as a metaphor, capillarity. And I hesitated in the broad strokes, and the word was capillarity in a PhD thesis, but I changed it to citizenship, and I'm going to attempt to explain it, because either one of them could be valid, but why I perhaps prefer today the word and drawing on the word citizenship rather than capillarity. 5 broad strokes concerning these 5 words. The first observation, pedagogy is cooperation. It's equal to. Pedagogy is, as first and foremost, cooperative work. Frey said this, Freire historically, this is nothing new. In Portugal, we have an extraordinary movement, which is that of the modern school, based always on the idea of cooperation. I'm not saying anything extraordinary or new. The only thing that I am saying, perhaps, which is somewhat outside the curve, is that it is not worthwhile to repeat these concepts if we don't have educational environments where they can be materialized in reality. And the idea of cooperation leads us to a question. This is a question It sounds easy. It sounds obvious, but it is a question which we rarely have asked in the recent decades. Rarely. The students learn from teachers. The answer is yes. Do they? Yes. The teachers are indispensable for work and for the students. But we haven't asked the second question. And what about the students? Do they learn from other students? And the answer is yes. The students also learn from other students. And this we have forgotten from the pedagogical point of view. Our best, the thing that we've forgotten was this idea that the students learn from other students. And here, and concerning university education and an innovation by Jorge Ramos do O, that thing that the director of this medical school at the Tavares University in the new medical curriculum, he said the following: we here in Évora had the best professors in the world. We recruit professors all over the world, and we have the best. We have the best professors here at the University of Évora. Nevertheless, we know that our students, they learn more from each other than they learn with us, the professors in the medical school. And the medical school's curriculum is organized such that to create the conditions for them to be able to study with each other, to learn from each other, and in cooperation. This in the School of Medicine in Évora. Pedagogy is the creation of the best conditions for joint work between professors and students, but students with students as well. And this dimension is central if we want to realize what we have ahead of us from the point of view of the pedagogical debate. The second word is that of convergence. We could seek other words, of course, but the word that I preferred here was the word convergence. Curriculum should be first and foremost conceived based on convergence. The curriculum should conceive the disciplines or literacies, the mathematical literacy, scientific literacy, artistic literacy, more as literacies. The word is not very beautiful in Portuguese, but there's no other word for it. To consider disciplines as literacies, or the course content as literacies, perhaps with this idea of that if we want to do a motto for education, a motto, perhaps the best motto would be education serves to learn, to understand, to learn to understand, and that is what is behind the idea of literacy in the context of work, based on the large themes and problems of humanity, convergence between various different areas in the study of themes and problems. Therefore, the evolution of a taxonomy, disciplinary taxonomy, a rigid one oriented towards a logic of convergence in knowledge, and I'm avoiding the word interdisciplinary because it is overloaded, oftentimes with a lot of misunderstandings, of course, in the sense of a convergence that allows us to work on themes and problems, projects, problems for the children to work on these important themes and problems, and indeed happens today. And with regard to science, science today is organized increasingly by themes and problems and increasingly less from a logic, a disciplinary, strict disciplinary logic. So there's an evolution of the curriculum, which is absolutely central, where we should never lose sight of the heritage of the disciplines, and we should never lose sight of this heritage, this legacy. But obviously we have to put ourselves at the service of a logic, a curricular logic, a different kind of curricular logic. The third word, as I said, is collaboration. It's a central word to define teachers' work. For years, we've used this word. Everybody remembers the text by Andy Hargreaves in the 1980s concerning collaboration. Andy Hargreaves in a collaborative profession. We all remember that from the 1980s. The problem is that to give a class in a classroom, with the door closed, it's not necessary to collaborate with anybody. And oftentimes the teachers consider it embarrassing collaboration, like it's imposed on them, something that's not part. They don't see the need for it at all. And it's necessary to conceive that in the new educational environments, we should value collaborative work, collective work, overcoming the traditional isolation of the faculty members, the teachers, the isolation with regard to the teaching work and pedagogical work. It's true that teachers have always been a very unionized profession, but it's not this collective dimension of union action. I'm talking about the pedagogical work of the teaching work, the professional work, and the daily practice, which this isolation is very strong there. And to give a class in a classroom, collaboration is irrelevant, perhaps, but to work in new educational environments where there are several different teachers at the same time working with several different student groups with the diversity in work and diversity of projects, collaboration is absolutely central and it's absolutely decisive. And this is one of the themes. It's one of the strong themes in the debate concerning teachers today. It's the evolution of the profession in this sense, more collaborative sense of the word. A fourth word to attempt to give context to this metamorphosis of the schools is a word that I'm going to seek with an author, Ivan Ilyich, who wrote 50 years ago, who wrote in 1971, 1972, Ivan Ilyich, that some translated into Portuguese as collective life. I use the literal translation, conviviality, and conviviality in the sense of schools as places where you learn to live with. The literal translation of the Latin roots of conviviality, work for a shared humanity with diversity and inclusion. And to say this, which says little apparently, it sounds like very little, it's to say something which for me is central. It's at the schools, one of the reasons, not the only reason, but one of the reasons that we cannot lose schools is that schools are perhaps today the only institution which still survives to work, to live, and share it with others, to learn to live in shared life with others. We've lost a lot of institutions, the villages, many social spaces. We've been losing a lot of the places where this idea was produced of a democratic school space and a space for work, for learning, and learning to live with others, and a space for listening and for dialogue. And this is a central dimension of schools. And it's necessary that we could never lose the idea of learning, we should measurable learning. A lot of schools involves meetings, encounters, affect, not just measuring learning, human relations. So it's not just measurable learnings. I read a text published today or yesterday in a Portuguese newspaper online where somebody recalled Georges Godard, the author from the 1960s in France, where he said that teachers are teachers of humanity, and the idea that the school is a place of humanity. It's an important idea today in living in fragmented societies. Oftentimes they're remote and distant from identity. We need institutions where this work is still possible to do, and the school has this matrix and this dimension. And my last C word, I'm nearing the end of the third section, And the fourth section is a short section near the end of the third section. Now, it's the word citizenship. I hesitated between capillarity and citizenship. I said just before. The idea at the end of the day, I'm going to introduce another concept which I don't like too much, which is the concept of educational cities or teaching cities. The relationship between schools, society should be based on the idea of the educational cities or the teaching cities and value participation in the public space of education, including educational cities or teaching cities. I'm calling attention to this dimension, citizens dimension, this civic dimensions of the polis and politics, the political city in the sense, in the broadest sense of the word. And to explain that today it's impossible, unthinkable to think of education only inside schools. And I am not falling into the illusion of educational ubiquity or omnipresence. Everything happens everywhere. That's not the point. At home, online. I'm not falling into that illusion. What I am saying is that the point of departure for the school institutions is that to build relations with other dimensions of the city that has having to value the dynamic of participation in the public space of education, where education has to go beyond the walls and borders of the school, which does not diminish the school's role. On the contrary, it values its presence. And I believe that many of the best authors in education today, many of them, like Piesta, Georges Lahossa, John Maskelyne, and so many others, have shown us the need to protect the schools, to not sit back. Okay, let's not have this futurist discourse. Everything is obsolete, outdated. The need, rather, to maintain a gaze and a view of this institution, which it's immutable. It's like an extraordinary invention, but obviously needs to be transformed. It needs to be transformed from a logic that I am attempting to share with you all. Saying it in differently. In other words, it's one of the mottos of the UNESCO report. We should say that schools have a great transformative power. We cite Nelson Mandela. We all quote Malala and give us a pencil and piece of paper and you can change the world. But to exercise this power, the school has to be transformed itself. It has to be a transformed school. Only thus is it able to fully exercise this transformative power. I thus reach my fourth and last section, a very short section, an extremely brief section to say to you all, but in all of this, what can schools and teachers do? And what the schools and teachers can do is also in collaboration with the universities. This is not the topic of my intervention today, but I deem it a great possibility for the universities and the major responsibility in teacher training, obviously, the universities, but the possibilities that go far beyond the teacher's profession in this debate concerning what schools and teachers can do. And placing and raising this question, I am saying, or I mean to say, that schools and teachers can do more than sometimes we even imagine. And I mean to say that for me, it's important to have three answers to this question. The first answer is that schools can sorry, we skipped a slide, that schools can launch into experiences and initiatives Thus, unfortunately, there are many schools all across the world which have launched initiatives, and which opened new paths in the field of education in schools. There is a lot done in the world. We at UNESCO, when we analyze what has been done in the world, we see thousands and thousands of experiences that are extraordinary, that are happening in the world. What is the problem with these experiences? The problem is that it has been written, not about education, by Morin. Edgar Morin said, talking about experiments with the climate and the climate struggle with alternatives from the climatic point of view. Edgar Morin said extraordinary things in the world, but these things are not known. They don't have visibility. These things are very one-off. They're fragmented. They're isolated. They're very one-off, isolated, unique, and they don't constitute a stronger dynamic for transformation. I feel that we need to know these experiences. We need to know these initiatives, to know what is being done, and if something we say we should require and demand today from the politicians, men and women, is that support these experiences, these initiatives. Don't complicate the lives through red tape or for any other reasons for whoever wants to launch these experiences, initiatives. In other words, perhaps rather radically, and I apologize for what I'm going to say if it's too radical, a change in education is not going to emerge from a new law or a new reform or from a new curriculum or from a new decree or a new theory. It will emerge from these experiences, the capacity to look at them and give them some feasibility and continuity. And for that to happen, as I was saying, and Edgar Morin said that we need to share experiences and to thus build, Edgar Morin said, a movement for transformation, a movement for change. These experiences are still not yet a movement of transformation. They still don't constitute a consistent transformative dynamic, and they still have this residual, more one-off, fragmented, isolated, a very interesting school there, an extraordinary thing yonder. But what is missing is to give them a more coherent dynamic and more consistent dynamic. And here, the universities, if they want to, can play an extremely interesting role. That the universities are institutions which have the capacity to echo, resonate, to give visibility to things which oftentimes the schools alone and teachers alone don't have. Here is a huge responsibility for universities in this sharing experiences, which if the universities want to do this, and if they have the conditions to do so, it would be absolutely extraordinary. And I'm saying this to you all, and I'm addressing my comments to other students that are present here in the PhD students, where we need to have doctoral programs and everything in education, but there's a dimension. Don't forget this dimension, which is the dimension of sharing, knowing what is being done in reality, to know what is being done in the schools, to know the experiences, the experiments, to analyze them, write about them, to attempt to have this dimension. It's an important dimension beyond all the other dimensions. I'm not overlooking any PhD thesis or any area in doctoral programs or any kind of titles. So everything should be welcomed and embraced in educational thinking. But what is missing and has been missing in recent decades in studies on education, what has been missing has been a closer view to the educational realities, a closer view to the teaching work and to these experiences. And this view is extremely important to build, for building this movement for transformation, and to publish. Teachers in schools, not just publishing a paper, but publicizing. I'm saying publicizing in the sense of making things public, to make public, publicizing, to allow an appropriation by the public of what is being done, consolidating there for a new social contract for education, a new contract for education, which celebrates people inside the schools and society, and these families and the parents. It's a contract celebrated with people who are inside and outside the schools. And to celebrate this new social contract for education, we need to publicize what is being done, publicize in this sense where George Steiner talked about publicizing the human soul, and publicizing and making public what is being done, consolidating thereby a new social contract for education. Everything that is there demonstrates that we need to find paths like this. There will not be one single path. There will be many different paths. The International Commission that I was a member of was called 72 in the Commission in 1996, the Commission Edgar Ford and Jacques Leroy, the International Commission on the Future of Education. But we refuse this title now, and now we ask the director of UNESCO to call us the International Commission on the Futures of Education in the plural. And she said, but the futures does not exist, not in French or English. Futures, you don't use it in the plural. And it's futures that we want. There's not going to be just one future. There'll be very many different plural futures with different paths, but they have to give rise to a new educational time, a new educational age that we call, with the concept of the new social contract for education. That's the term we use, never overlooking or forgetting that if there's a Jean-Jacques Rousseau on the social contract, it was published exactly with this term, the same year where they published his main educational work, the Education, two works by Rousseau published precisely in the same year, precisely at the same time. And to celebrate also this, we use this new concept of the futures of education. By way of conclusion, it's the last slide that I have to share with you all. The last thing that I have to say to you is that answering and responding to the idea of what schools and teachers can do, the only thing that I can say as a Portuguese proverb, which I believe also translates in Brazil, what I can say to you is that, and with conviction, is that teachers can be prophets in their own land. Teachers can be prophets in their own land. We have to pursue these miracles pursued by teachers, schools in Brazil, Portugal. From these miracles, we'll have the possibility of a new social contract for education. I hope that this is what you will be able to discuss. You can be able to enjoy in this conference lecture series that we designed, seeking people that we deem the most capable of thinking and analyzing these things, which I laid out here for you all, based on multilateral and United Nations view, viewed from the intellectual and academic space, hoping and believing that in May we can have a lecture series which is enlightening with some academic products and some texts, and that we can move marching in this direction. And I myself will attempt to give my contribution over this lecture series, with the series introducing the speakers, but also over the course of these months, I will attempt, as I already announced, to do a pedagogical journey and travel to the schools in Portugal, attempting to learn what is being done in the schools in Portuguese one day. I hope, if I still have time and energy, and I am still in conditions to extend this journey, pedagogical journey to schools in Portugal, a pedagogical journal to schools in Brazil, and to be able to translate, reflect on, and explain, publicizing everything that's done. This is the objective of this lecture series, with a theoretic intellectual debate, a political debate, and multilateralism, but also demonstrating much of what has been done in the sense of this social contract. It's combining these two dimensions. That's what makes this the reason for this lecture series, which I hope that you can all enjoy and participate in, and many other colleagues from Portugal and Brazil and elsewhere in the world, from elsewhere in the world. It's broadcast all across the world, and what I'm saying to be translated into English. And I like to thank the interpreters that have done this work. And I know that I spoke faster than I should have, but that's life. Sorry. Okay. And I hope that we can jointly take a journey in the coming months in this lecture series. 2 or 3 questions if you'd like. No, I'm available. So thank you very much for your attention.
Two or three brief questions, if any. And you're kindly reminded to make sure you come up front and use the microphone because we want to make sure you are on tape for our Brazil-based colleagues. Yes, good afternoon, everyone. Microphone, please. Can you hear me? Professor, how can one foster conviviality in the school setting while teachers are being trained and prepared in increasingly technical courses, professional development courses? Claudia just invited me to engage in a discussion on teacher training and professional development. However, I am unable to do that here today, given time constraints. But having said that, it is nevertheless obvious that we do very much need to look into that. And I'm going to be very cautious about saying what I'm going to say, but I think we do need an about phase, a revolution in teacher training, because the teacher training we have today no longer reflects what I described during the presentation, nor does it reflect our needs. It does not respond to anything really in today's world. And I hope that this weekend I will be able to finish writing an article precisely on teacher training. A third revolution is the title. And in the article, I try to argue about the need for new approaches in teacher training, because without a renewed teacher training approach, only with difficulty will we be able to materialize many of these things we're talking about, especially more collaborative, active kind of efforts. But this is life. That's what the life is like. We should not wait for another 4, 5, 10 years, to engage in renewed teacher training approaches. We must act and start promoting changes. In the field of education, we can never afford to wait for things and say, hey, first teacher training and only later, 10 years from now, will we change things. We must work in parallel, do things at the same time, concomitantly. And I strongly believe that if there's one thing that is important for teacher training, is that teacher training should, if at all possible, be largely anchored on these experiences and initiatives I have been talking about. Because ideally, teacher training should be intertwined with all of these different initiatives and experiences. And as such, teacher training would greatly benefit from this emerging culture and these novel dynamics that we currently have before us. Any further questions? The floor is open. Yes, I'm Vitor Hugo Cardoso, master's degree student on information technology. My question is directly to education managers and the teachers that will be involved in the futures of education. From information technology perspective, I have noted that the industry players have been active for many years. I believe that the futures will also have to be developed by the research players. And these include Sérgio Amado, a colleague, Gonçalves Amado, Salve Silva, and education historians. How is it that the Portuguese state plans to mainstream these experts to benefit from their contribution to foster the futures of education to the benefit of our students? That's a very specific question, and a very important question as well. In other words, how do you mainstream into the teaching profession? How do you integrate in the teaching profession? How do you bring on board highly qualified professionals in different fields? Of course, that can or may prove easier or more difficult in different fields or areas. When we are very much familiar with what you mentioned, as president of the University of Lisbon, the main problem I had was to hire information technology professionals, because in the non-public career, they would earn much more than in the public sector. So that is a problem that requires us to try to equate payment levels among different teaching or different IT practitioners, knowing all too well that in many cases there may be solutions involving linkages between what is within the school setting and outside of the school setting. There may be several different collaborative linkage solutions that have not always been used or resorted to, particularly in Portugal. And the idea that has proved very strong in Portugal and which remains very strong in Portugal, the idea based on a territorial concept, thinking about the schools in or within a given territory and possibilities that are available in territory, I believe that may help us move ahead and overcome some of these challenges and issues, knowing all too well that for very specific questions such as the one you mentioned, the solution will prove very specific and very complex, because we cannot, of course, foster divisions or fractures within the teaching community. But these are approaches that we will certainly have to espouse and gradually and progressively find solutions to the issues we face. Very good. One last question. I am Vera. It's not so much of a question, but rather of a statement, because in these debates, we often talk about early childhood or early teacher training, professional development, and teachers themselves are also trained in the school system. I think that academic knowledge should not be divorced and distant from hands-on and more direct work and activity. The partnerships must evolve, and we must be able to pinpoint those who are actually working out there and developing efforts and the work of a high level of excellence. That is absolutely key, and we must, of course, focus on those other players in the school setting, the support personnel and the other players, because we're ultimately not alone, and we must bring on board all of those who are actively involved in the school setting. I would, of course, like to take the opportunity. Thank you very much. It's been a great inspiration listening to you, Professor Nóvoa. Well, thank you so much for those remarks. I know what I'm going to say is not exactly what you said, but I would nevertheless like to take the opportunity, having heard what you said, to say that the worst in educational thinking, and this is oftentimes translated in teacher training, the worst thing that can happen in the educational training is a dichotomy, theory versus practice, the university versus schools, or arts versus sciences, teaching versus learning, freedom versus authority. I mean, we could spend a whole hour listing all of the different dichotomies that erode and plague educational thinking. But the fact is that there is no solution to dichotomies. The only solution to dichotomies would be a third factor, a third element. As I have written many years ago, I used a reference to a tale by a Brazilian novelist Guimarães Rosa. Education is the third bank of the river. It is a movement. It is a synthesis. Durkheim, the towering figure in French sociology, who was also a well-known philosopher in the philosophy of education, he wrote a text on pedagogy, asking whether pedagogy was theory or practice. And after extensively discussing about the matter, he solved the problem by stating that pedagogy is a practical theory or vice versa, a theoretical practice. In other words, the issue can never be posed as a dichotomy, but rather in terms of how we can move towards a synthesis and how we can bring things together and think of pedagogy and think of teacher training and approach the reality from a third perspective, third reality or standpoint, from a third focus or approach. And for this third alternative approach, there is one element which I believe is very important and which I believe often irritates many people in the university circles, including in Brazil, but it is something I often say repeatedly. One of the most brilliant authors in teacher training or indeed teacher training literature, someone who has very much fallen into oblivion in the education or educational debate, author Gilles Ferry, a French author, back in 1973, drafted a remarkable article called Le Trajet de la Formation, the pathway of teacher training, where he described three different models for teacher training. The first model was the traditional model based on learning and acquisition of knowledge. The second model was a more pedagogy-oriented model centered on processes and methodologies. And the third model, the model he advocated, was actually more centered on analysis, an analysis of situations, things, experience, an analysis that is not always practical, but always theoretical in nature, an analysis of a review of how one does things and how we can critically think about it and mobilize theory as a result. And this, of course, leads us to move in a sense of convergence and proximity. Gilles Ferry actually opened his book with the following quotation, and I haven't read his books for many years. I'm actually quoting him from memory. In my most recent articles, actually in the recent book I wrote titled Teachers and Liberating the Futures, I actually have quite a few books on this matter, and I actually opened the book with a quotation, and it is actually a truism, a very obvious statement, a truism. Nevertheless, these very obvious things oftentimes have to be stated. Teacher training is about professional training because we're training teachers to be professionals. And saying this oftentimes irritates certain people because it sounds like a minor thing to say, because it's just a technical or a minor thing that is not highly appreciated. I know it is a truism, but it is the kind of truism that must be repeated. And it is precisely at this professional dimension that we are able to find the sentences I referred to. Because the teaching profession is not, say, practical, or the teaching is not very often the school floor, as we often say in Brazil, or the profession is not, say, the terrain, as they say in France. The profession is practice, it's theory, it's cultural, it's about ideology, it's the political component, it's the symbolic dimension. In other words, the profession as such is the overall ensemble of all of these dimensions, and therefore it must be developed as a comprehensive skill set. And interestingly enough, when we talk about these issues, as I described during the conference, the first reaction, which was also reflected in your questions, is the reaction of saying, yes, okay, but what about teacher training? How are we going to ensure teachers for the futures of education? I agree, but then again, I do not believe that teacher training should be described as being the original geniuses or the beginning of all beginnings from which we will be able to revolutionize everything. Because teacher training will only be revolutionized if and when more things are happening in the school setting and when these novelties are connected, because realities will evolve in parallel and there is not such a sequence of one thing first followed by the second, etc. That's not how life works. In life, we work with whatever we have, and it will be largely the result of these evolving changes and the interlinkages between what's being done in the university circles and the school setting. In our education institute, there have been many research efforts on these issues and high quality research projects, actually, as well as many schools have engaged in this kind of effort. And this is the kind of effort we should further deepen and expand if we're serious about moving along these lines. I'm quite certain that there will be many teachers attending our cycle of conferences. I will certainly ask our next guest speakers to attach special attention to teacher training. And I'm sure, of course, Stefania Giannini is very much focused on that, as well as Bert Biesta. Padurai himself has discussed the issue extensively in his recent reflections, and I'm sure the debate will go on. So this concludes our first conference. We've gone slightly beyond 1 hour, but not much. I want to thank you all for attending this meeting in person in the University of Lisbon. I wish our Brazil-based colleagues, the online attendees, and participants, and also a special thanks to our collaborators from UNESCO Brazil who have been so instrumental in organizing this cycle of conference. Thank you so much, and we will be seeing you again on the 27th of October, about a month. Jorge Ramos, José Pedro Serra, and Nina Ranieri, first two speakers from the University of Lisbon, and Nina Ranieri from the University of São Paulo, Brazil. Thank you very much. We will be in touch. Till next time.